This is episode 4 of the podcast Communicate Like This. Episode 4 is titled Assumptions and Universality. If this is the first episode of the show you'll listen to, I encourage you to stop listening after this intro and instead go to episode 1 titled Listen to This First. Clever name for that, eh? After listening to that, I'd encourage you to listen to the episodes in numerical order. Later episodes will make more sense this way since they'll often refer to lessons learned in earlier episodes. Just a heads up that the next minute of this intro is a repeat of what you have heard in previous episodes that sets the context for the entire podcast series. So if you've heard it before, hang with me for a few more seconds, or just fast forward until you get to the real new episode. Thanks. The full title of the podcast is Communicate Like This and Everything Will Work Better for Everyone. Really, that's what I'm trying to accomplish. Make things better. Hardly anyone has ever been trained in how to communicate effectively, even though communication is foundational to getting through life. So, most of us are amateurs when it comes to talking, even though we've all got a lifetime of experience at talking. As a result, our world, business lives, and personal lives are fraught with miscommunication, misunderstandings, preventable arguments, and stress, among a much longer list of bad consequences related to ineffective communication. I want to break that dynamic by providing people some tools that they can use to achieve a true mutual understanding among the people they communicate with. So, thanks for tuning in and becoming part of the communication revolution. Look for new podcasts with communication tips and techniques about once a week. If you can successfully learn and implement the communication tools we'll talk about over time in this podcast series, both your personal and business lives will improve. Hey, you finally made it past what is now about 2 minutes of boilerplate intro. Way to go. Remember that after episode 5, the next one, I'll be eliminating most of this since by episode 6 you'll probably have it memorized. However, a key learning tool is repetition. Let's get to the meat of today's episode. For this episode, I was initially going to focus solely on unspoken assumptions and how identifying and exposing them to examination leads to true effective communication. Unspoken assumptions is a big topic that'll take more than one episode to cover anyway, so I want to go off plan just a bit because of the great feedback that I've gotten from you being the larger listener audience, including real-life examples of how core values and principles affect the daily lives of people. Just as a point of info, I'll frequently use the acronym CVPs to interchange with core values and principles, so get used to that. Through these real-life issues we'll talk about today, I'll introduce you to some additional communication tools. Please keep the feedback coming, since while so far I'm the only voice you're hearing on this podcast, I do think this is a group effort and we'll all learn better together if we get everyone actively involved to share different perspectives on topics I present. As a reminder, you can send comments by going to any of the episodes and clicking on the Read More link in the episode summary below the media player bar and filling in the comment box that appears. Of course, you find those things at www.communicatelikethis.com. I had a couple of questions about my belief that the core values and principles I laid out in the last episode are universal in nature. Do they really apply everywhere to everyone? Now, that term universality, I don't know if I made it up or not, but it seemed like an appropriate word to use in discussing this whole concept. I mean, there are many different cultures in the world and many different upbringings. To address this question, let me take a brief sidetrack related to these differences. An extreme case would be with me speaking in Swahili and you speaking in English. Effective communication would be really hard in that case. Sure, we could both talk, but talking isn't usually the point of talking. Mutual understanding is what we're trying to achieve. One of the keys to effective communication is to make sure that we're applying the same definitions to words or phrases. More often, misunderstandings are the result of two people using the same words but having different understandings about what those words mean. Sure, if you're all speaking English, you'll mostly be using the same words, but sometimes one person may use a word like universality that the other person simply hasn't heard before. Person A assumes person B knows the word and so simply continues on speaking, believing that everyone is on the same page. However, if person B doesn't know the word, then they may make certain assumptions, usually unspoken assumptions, that just don't fit with what person A intended. It's been said that unspoken assumptions are the silent assassins of effective communication. Let me give you an example from my homeowners association, or HOA, that I said previously might come up a few times in the course of this podcast. Well, here we go again. Another owner and I were having a discussion about making decisions in secret and not informing the rest of the HOA about the issue. I asked if she was afraid of her ideas seeing the light of day because then they might be disproven or thrown out entirely through some open debate. You might have guessed that by now I think that the more open and honest people are, the better it is for communication and understanding. So I was just talking in the abstract in more of a what-if scenario. However, her response to that was to say, "I'm not afraid of you, Dan." Now, you might think that this was not a big deal, but knowing this person from my previous experience with her, I assumed she was steering the conversation down the road of me making a physical threat to her. Not remotely my intention, but also not a good situation in the Me Too era. Especially since I'm a big man, about 6 feet 4 inches tall and about 200 pounds on a good day. I know that I can intimidate people, even if I don't think I am or want to. I can just be sitting there minding my own business, and a person with some bad experiences with people my size could assume the worst. In the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is one of the best movies to combine animation with live action, plus a good plot, Jessica Rabbit, one of the animated characters, said, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." Or think of Popeye's famous line of, "I am what I am." I can't help being a big guy, but other people don't know that I've only been in 2 fights in my life, and both of those were in grade school, with a total of 1 punch thrown. I'm a pacifist by nature. So how did the conversation go from a discussion of ideas to a fear of a physical assault? Talk about your radical turns. From an effective communication standpoint, though, it really doesn't make any difference. Again, knowing a bit about this person and how she's reacted in the past, I could just hear the gossip starting in the neighborhood that Dan threatened this person. An assumption on my part, but one that I wanted to take pains to ensure didn't become reality. The key here is that I recognized the 2 unspoken assumptions that were being made, and I put them on the table for examination. First, I assumed that she assumed the potential of physical violence. Second, I assumed false gossip might start circulating in the neighborhood about me. To prevent all of that, I responded by overtly saying that I didn't intend my comment to be taken as a physical threat, but as simply asking about her ideas and their validity. Now, by recognizing these unspoken assumptions and putting them on the table, the conversation got back on track. Just think of the argument that would have ensued without that clarification. Imagine the wasted time being used to talk through a side issue in likely a heated fashion versus sticking to the main issue that was at hand. I've come to realize that so many of the communication tools you'll hear in this podcast are preventative in nature. It's often hard to see the benefit at the time, especially when there wasn't any argument, because it was entirely avoided. But if we could go back in time and choose a different path, kind of like what happened to Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, you'd see the benefits immediately. So when you put an unspoken assumption on the table, at least give yourself a kudos to reinforce what you've done to minimize stress in your life. To be more explicit, here's the effective communication tool that you can add to your toolbox. In the heat of a conversation, recognize unspoken assumptions and put them on the table for examination. This sounds pretty simple on the surface, but as I've said before, the ability to do this with consistency is one of the hardest challenges to overcome that you'll undertake in your professional or personal life. But the better you get at it, the less stress, misunderstandings, miscommunication, and arguments you'll have. Unspoken assumptions is a topic that we'll cover in much more depth in later episodes. It's truly a major, impactful topic for any effective communications, and so deserves some time spent on it. Most people, in my opinion, are kind of flip or cavalier about assumptions without truly understanding the impact that they have on a daily basis. Many have heard the old bromide about breaking down the spelling of the word assume into parts, that assume really means making an ass, ASS, out of you, the letter U, and me. Making an ass out of you and me. Yeah, funny, but if you stop your thinking there, don't really give it much thought, and can't turn that into an effective communication tool, then you're missing the boat on a powerful way to make your life easier. Sure, you may intellectually agree with the concept of putting unsaid assumptions on the table, but this podcast is about turning nods of agreement into nods of understanding, and turning nods of understanding into actions. So, back to the initial question of the universality of core values and principles. A lot of that depends on people having the same definition of them. First, we have to have clarity on those definitions among all of us without any unspoken assumptions involved. We covered the definitions of CVPs near the end of episode 3, so I won't go over them again for now, probably in later episodes though, in more detail. But understand that the application of them and the logic of obtaining the subsequent results when properly applied is irrefutable. As an aside, yes, I understand that by making that statement that the logic is irrefutable will likely open me up for examples of ideas that refute the logic. Just because, if nothing else, there are a lot of contrarians in the world. That's okay. Bring them on. I'll take them as they come. But remember 2 ground rules for the debate that can't be violated or the argument becomes invalid. First, the goal here is to reduce misunderstandings, miscommunication, arguments, and stress. Second, the core values and principles must be utilized as a single unit as the means to an end. It's not just one CVP, but the team of CVPs and the tools that they use to implement them that makes this whole thing work in total. Everything you might try to use to refute the universality concept must be presented in alignment with those 2 ground rules. One listener, in questioning this universality concept, pointed out in their comments that in many cultures, hierarchy is prized more than teamwork, and she picked teamwork as just one of the core values and principles as an example. Or in the American Wild West culture, she said, individualism is prized more than teamwork. Now, those may in fact be true, but that still doesn't mean that a hierarchical society has fewer arguments or less stress. My point is that if the CVPs are blended into any society, then the goal we're after will be more easily achieved. The CVPs are not dependent on any given culture, but if the culture incorporates the CVPs, then things will work better for everyone. The universality is associated with using the tools and CVPs, not whether a given culture accepts those CVPs and tools. Think of it this way. If you have a nail and you want to drive it into a piece of wood, a universal tool to use to drive the nail is a hammer. The hammer may take many forms, but it is culture neutral. The hammer will work whether you live in China, India, Brazil, or I don't know, let's pick another country at random. Say Norway, for instance. Now, you may, hopefully some of you got that joke. Now, maybe you may reject the use of a hammer on philosophical grounds, but that doesn't negate the intrinsic value of the hammer or make it less universal for driving a nail into wood. With CVPs, you have the equivalent of a nail in the form of miscommunication, misunderstandings, arguments, and stress that you want to do something with. If you choose to use core values and principles and their associated tools, then you'll be able to drive the nail into the wood. 2 listeners also commented on the universality issue from another perspective. That being, what do you do with someone who doesn't want to play the game? What if they simply refuse to operate using core values and principles? Take a nihilist, for example. Please. Sorry to the younger crowd, but that was a takeoff on an old Henny Youngman joke that I just couldn't resist. Google it if you don't know it and expand your social consciousness. But back to the nihilist. Now, I wasn't even sure what a nihilist was when the listener presented the idea of not agreeing to use core values and principles, so I Googled it. Honestly, I never thought this podcast would ever remotely include a discussion about nihilism, but here we go anyway. A nihilist, and that's spelled Nihilist, is a person who rejects all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. You know, you'll learn all sorts of interesting info in this podcast besides core values and principles. Just stay tuned. So, if you run across a person like this, and you're filled with the spirit of core values and principles, you believe in them thoroughly and to your soul, what do? How can you accomplish that goal of mutual understanding? Or maybe worse, what about folks who just plain like chaos and thrive on drama, who take a contrarian view of whatever is presented to them just because they like to? I'm not sure there's an actual English word with this definition, but antagonist or calathumpian probably come close. I mean, as long as we're going to incorporate obscure English words in this podcast, why not use calathumpian? I'd Google that too if you're interested. However, just doing that is not my intent, but it was a good diversion. What if we just agree to use the word antagonist for this type of chaos-inducing person? As long as we all agree on this term, then our future conversations can simply use the term for a common understanding, regardless of whether it's exactly the right term for the concept of chaos-inducing. If you've got a better word for this type of person, please let me know, because I really am interested, and you can use that comments box on the website to do that. Back to what to do with these types of people who simply want to disrupt conversation. That's a tougher nut to crack, but here are some strategies. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on other approaches that may work too, and we can certainly discuss those in later episodes. My general advice is to keep using the communication tools you've learned so far and those that are upcoming in future episodes. Redouble your efforts to get that mutual understanding and search your brain for applicable tools. Get very intentional and deliberate with using the communication tools that you've learned. But maybe you finally determine that you just can't get there with the antagonist. What do? If you're in a business environment, the issue you're trying to resolve is important to the business, you have an out by involving your boss or the antagonist's boss. Escalate the issues to higher levels, but focusing on the business issue, not that the antagonist is a jerk. If you put the situation in terms of how it's affecting the business operations, and the business profitability, you'll likely get some help from upper management to resolve the issue. Getting the approval of a higher authority and having directives issued will solve the problem. You may not change the overall behavior of the antagonist, but you will get your business issue resolved, and you'll send a message to the antagonist that maybe the next time they would be better served to engage in trying to achieve a mutual understanding versus stonewalling. The harder situation to deal with is when it's personal in nature. Generally, you have no higher authority to go to for resolution. You're just stuck in a one-on-one stalemate with the other person and no one is budging. Now what do? Even here, the core values and principles can give you at least some guidance. One route to take is to agree to disagree without resolution and move on. That seems like a cop-out, but it may be the healthiest solution. Just agree to not raise the issue again with the other person, because that will only lead to more arguments and more stress. You're not going to convince them. They're not going to convince you. At some point, you have to reach the conclusion that it's a lost cause and there's no way the other person will change their mind regardless of the amount of logic and facts you throw at them. I've had to do just that with one of my good friends regarding some political issues. Just don't broach the subject anymore. We're still friends, and we did want to keep our friendship, so we just don't talk politics, at least in any detail, anymore. Now that doesn't stop me from thinking, how in the hell can he still believe what he believes in the face of all the evidence? But at least we're not arguing endlessly and creating stress for both of us. What the strategy does is at least show respect for the other person, with respect being one of the core values and principles we talked about. You're acknowledging their opinion and doing so without denigrating them. You've also incorporated the principle of true prioritization by lowering the priority of talking politics with that person. You've also incorporated simplification by eliminating that issue from your life, at least relative to that person. The result of applying these 3 CVPs, less arguing and less stress. That's a win. To summarize today's episode, core values and principles are universal in nature. They are simply tools to use in applicable situations, and any culture can use them if they choose to do so. As a side note, I go a step further and say that the vast majority of people will understand and would be willing to use these CVPs and their associated communication tools if they just knew about them. Hence, this podcast. Now, I don't have any particular facts or data or logic, or at least a lot of logic, to back that up, other than I'm generally an optimist and believe the best about people, until they demonstrate otherwise. We also learned in this episode about unspoken assumptions, identifying them and putting them on the table for examination as to their validity. We'll deal a lot more with assumptions and their impacts on effective communication in later episodes, but for now, simply developing an awareness of their existence in the middle of a conversation is what you should practice. Doing this may well be the hardest thing you'll tackle in your life to become adept at it, but it is learnable and is one of the most powerful tools to use to be truly effective in your communication with others. Well, that about wraps it up for today. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard today, please tell your friends about Communicate Like This. You can find the podcast on all major podcast sites like Apple, Google, and about 50 others, if not more. On the web, we're at communicatelikethis.com. There, you can also leave comments about any given podcast. You can also find more abbreviated conversations and interactions on our Facebook site at Communicate Like This. You'll also find occasional brief tips on Twitter. Just search for @RealDanPerky. If you're looking for something more substantive, please give my management book, Uncommon Sense Management, on Amazon a try. It's in both paperback and Kindle form. Now, if you think your business could benefit from some on-site training to not only make employees happier, but increase productivity and profitability, go to theopendoorgroup.com and see what we offer. Final reminder, though, before we go. Action is the key to success in reducing misunderstandings, miscommunication, preventable arguments, and stress. This isn't some academic exercise we're engaged in. If you don't actually use these tools in your personal interactions with people, then the whole podcast is just a waste of time. Now, don't expect to use all of the tools all at once every day. Have the self-awareness to find the opportunities as they arise and then pull out the appropriate tools and use them to get a true mutual understanding with folks. Like Marshawn Lynch said, it's all about that action, boss.